In the middle of old Missouri, long before the land was quiet and paved with roads, there lived a man whose name carried fear like a shadow. His name was Jim Crow Chiles. Some people whispered it in bars, others refused to say it at all. But everyone knew that when Jim Crow Chiles walked into town, the air changed. People stopped talking, men stepped aside, women pulled their children close, and the town held its breath. Jim Crow Chiles was not a famous outlaw in the way that Jesse James or the younger brothers were. He did not rob trains or steal from banks. He did not lead gangs or create plans that made newspapers across the country. Instead, he was something different, something far more unpredictable. He was a man who carried danger inside him like a spark, always ready to become a flame. Number one knew when he would burn, but they knew they did not want to be near him when he did. To understand the story of Jim Crow Chiles, a person must step back in time to the rough years of the mid-1800s. Missouri was a place of conflict, argument, and deep division. People argued about politics, land, and slavery. Families fought families. Neighbors fought neighbors. And in this world of anger and tension, young Jim Crow grew up. From the very beginning, he was known for two things: a fast temper and an even faster hand with a gun. While other boys learned to farm or trade, Jim seemed to learn only two lessons: how to survive and how to fight. He had sharp eyes and a restless spirit. He was not afraid of anyone, and if he was, he never let it show. That fearlessness made him respected by some, but it also made him dangerous. Many young men in Missouri tried to avoid trouble. Jim, however, was the kind of man trouble followed. It was as if the world around him was always waiting for him to explode. People said he walked with a kind of swagger, not because he wanted attention, but because he simply did not know how to walk carefully. He pushed open doors like he owned the building. He spoke with a sharp tongue, and when someone insulted him, or even looked at him the wrong way, he was quick to answer with fists or steel. Some admired him for his courage. Others feared him for his anger. But no one ignored him. When he became a grown man, something happened that changed the path of his life forever. He married Sarah Ann Younger, a woman from one of the most well-known families in Missouri. The Youngers were not yet famous for outlaw legends, but they were already known for their strength, their pride, and their willingness to defend themselves with guns if needed. By marrying into the Younger family, Jim formed bonds that would shape his future in ways he could never have imagined. This marriage connected him to Cole Younger, who would later become one of the most feared riders of the James Younger gang. But long before Cole became an outlaw, he saw Jim Crow Chiles as the fiery uncle who always reacted first and thought later. In fact, many Younger family members believed that Jim's wild personality set an example that later influenced the younger men. He showed them what it meant to stand up for loyalty and family even if it meant violence. But Jim's story was bigger than family. It was tied to something darker and more powerful, the coming storm of the American Civil War. Missouri became a place of chaos. There were no clear battle lines. There were no safe towns. Guerrilla fighters, both for the North and the South, roamed through fields and forests. Raids, ambushes, and sudden attacks became a part of daily life. And a man like Jim Crow Chiles, who already lived close to violence, found a place where his temper and his courage were not only accepted, they were needed. But before that war began, people already spoke of Jim as if he were a warning. They said he was a man made of fire, someone who could never fully be trusted, but also could not be ignored. They told stories about him inside dim saloons, where the smell of whiskey mixed with fear. Some stories were true, others were not, but each one added to the legend of a man who walked the world as if he were not afraid to die. Those who knew Jim personally often said he had two sides. One side was gentle, loyal, and protective. He could be warm to his family. He loved his children. He helped neighbors when he thought they deserved help. But his other side, the darker side, was always just under his skin. It was the side that reacted with violence, the side that did not forgive insults, the side that believed strength was the only thing that mattered in a world full of enemies. And because of this, even before the war, Jim Crow Chiles was already a story waiting to happen. He was already a man people watched closely. He was already a match thrown toward dry grass. What he did next would shock the frontier. What he became would shape a legend, and what he lost would turn his story into one of the most tragic, forgotten tales of the Wild West. This is the beginning of that story. Asterisk. Jim Crow Chiles was already known as a fierce young man when he met Sarah Ann Younger, the woman who would forever tie him to one of the most powerful families in Missouri. Their meeting was simple. Quiet, nothing like the loud, violent life Jim was used to. But there was something about Sarah that settled him, at least for a moment. She had soft eyes, a calm voice, and a steady spirit that balanced his storm. People who knew them said that Sarah was one of the few people who could ease Jim's anger with just a look. But marrying Sarah did more than give Jim a wife. It gave him a new identity. He was no longer just Jim Crow Chiles, the hot-tempered fighter from Missouri. He became part of the Younger family, and the Younger family was no ordinary group. They were strong, proud, and deeply connected to the land. They believed in honor, loyalty, and standing together through anything, and they expected the same from anyone who joined them. The Youngers were already known for their bold personalities. Even before the Civil War, they stood out. Men like Cole Younger, Sarah's younger brother, had a sharp mind and a quick hand. He admired Jim's courage, but also understood the danger that followed him. Cole once said that Jim walked like a man who carried the whole world on his shoulders, dared anyone to try taking it off. Becoming part of this family meant becoming part of their stories. At family gatherings, Jim listened to tales about disputes with neighbors, fights on dusty roads, and long histories rooted in Missouri soil. These stories only added fuel to his already fiery nature. He felt at home among people who believed in defending honor with action, sometimes even with fists or guns. But there was something deeper behind the marriage, something that connected Jim to the future without him knowing it. The Younger brothers would one day join the infamous James Younger gang, riding beside legends like Frank and Jesse James. They would become names written in newspapers, whispered in saloons, and carved into American history. And Jim Crow Chiles would become part of that circle, not as a gang member, but as the intense, unpredictable uncle who influenced many of their early ideas about survival and strength. Jim cared deeply for Sarah. Despite his temper, he tried to build a peaceful home for her. They had children, and neighbors sometimes said that Jim could be surprisingly gentle when he was with them. His voice softened, and his wild eyes seemed to relax. But even in moments of peace, there was always a quiet tension around him. It was as if the world outside the home kept tapping on the door, reminding him that trouble never stayed away for long. Life in Missouri during those years was not easy. Political arguments were growing louder. Some people supported the Union, others supported the Confederacy. Families who had lived side by side for years suddenly found themselves enemies. People argued in church, at marketplaces, everywhere. And Jim, who was never one to back down from a challenge, found himself pulled into these conflicts more often than he wanted. Being a Younger by marriage meant expectations. The family was loyal to the South, loyal to tradition, and loyal to their community. Jim shared those beliefs. So when tensions in Missouri slowly turned into violence, he did not hesitate to pick a side. He felt it was his duty to defend his family's honor, to stand with the Youngers, and to protect the way of life he believed was under threat. The marriage also tied him to a community filled with whispers, warnings, and rumors. People said the Youngers were hot-blooded. They said they were too quick to act. Some admired them, others feared them. But in every conversation, Jim's name appeared as a spark one that could ignite anything. The Youngers accepted him. They understood him. But even within the family, there were quiet conversations about the danger of his anger. As political tension turned to open hostility, Jim felt the world closing in. He wanted to protect his family, but he also wanted to protect his pride. He wanted to stay peaceful, but peace never lasted long in Missouri. Every argument, every insult, every pressure from outside heard through the windows of the Chiles home pushed him closer to the edge. Sarah often tried to calm him. She spoke softly when he paced the room. She reminded him that the children needed him. She encouraged him to stay focused on the farm and ignore the growing troubles outside. But deep down, she knew she could only stop him for so long. Jim was a man who reacted with his whole heart, and his heart was pulled toward action. The youngers stood behind him as tensions rose, and though no one could predict the war that was coming, everyone could feel it. Missouri was like dry grass in the heat of summer, waiting for the first spark. And when that spark came, it would not only set the land on fire, it would set Jim Crow Chiles on the path to becoming one of the wildest figures of the Civil War era. This was the turning point. This was the moment before the storm. This was the part of his life where peace slipped away, and history began. The quiet Missouri mornings were changing. The wind felt different, carrying not the smell of farms and earth, but the heavy scent of fear. People spoke in low voices, glancing over shoulders, watching neighbors as if they were strangers. And in the middle of this rising tension stood Jim Crow Chiles, a man who had spent his whole life waiting for a fight he didn't yet understand. For months, Missouri felt like a boiling pot. Arguments turned into threats. Threats turned into small acts of violence, and those small acts quickly grew bigger. Neighbors burned each other's barns. Old friendships collapsed overnight. The country was splitting in two north against South Hand, Missouri, was caught directly in the middle. Jim saw the change clearly, even before the first real battles began. He heard men in town argue about loyalty and freedom. He watched groups divide, each side certain the other was wrong. And deep inside him, something familiar awoke a feeling he had carried since he was young. It was the same feeling he had during fights, the same heat that rose in his chest when anyone disrespected his family. It was the sense that a storm was coming, and he was meant to be inside it, not hiding from it. When the Civil War finally exploded in 1861, Jim Crow Chiles did not hesitate. The youngers were loyal to the Confederacy, and Jim followed that path with certainty. He believed, like many in Missouri, that the South's way of life was under attack. He believed he had a duty to defend his land, his family, and his beliefs. And because he already lived on the edge of violence, the war felt almost natural to him, like the world was finally aligning with who he already was. But Missouri's war was different from other places. It was not clean, not organized, not fought on clear fields. It was fought in shadows, on back roads, in forests, and in the dead of night. It was a war of guerrilla fighters, men who did not wear uniforms, who attacked without warning, who used surprise and speed as their weapons. This was the world Jim Crow Chiles walked into, a world perfectly suited to a man who trusted his instincts over rules. Jim soon became associated with the most feared guerrilla fighters in the region, and among them was a name that still chills the history books: William Bloody Bill Anderson. Bloody Bill Anderson was a man shaped entirely by violence. His raids were brutal, his enemies stopped at nothing, and his reputation traveled faster than his horse. To outsiders, he was a monster. To the men who rode with him, he was a leader who fought with unmatched fury. And Jim Crow Chiles fit easily into this world. The two men understood each other without speaking. Both carried a deep anger. Both believed the enemy deserved no mercy. Both preferred action over talk, and both had lost too much to ever return to peaceful life. Under Anderson, Jim learned new forms of warfare: quick strikes, fast retreats, sudden ambushes. He learned to ride hard, shoot fast, and disappear into the trees before the smoke cleared. It wasn't honorable war. It wasn't gentle or controlled. It was violent, raw, and lawless. But in that chaos, Jim thrived. He became known among the guerrillas for his sharp aim and fearless attitude. Men said he charged into danger as if he felt protected by fate itself. They said he fought like a man trying to outrun something inside him, some old anger that had no name. As the war grew more brutal, Jim's reputation grew as well. Union supporters saw him as a dangerous rebel. Southern families saw him as a defender. But everyone agreed on one thing: Jim Crow Chiles was not a man to cross. Stories spread quickly. Some said he rode through towns with fire in his eyes. Others claimed he fought like a man possessed. Whether all the stories were true didn't matter. In those dark times, fear was as powerful as fact, and Jim, without meaning to, became a symbol of that fear. But even as he fought, there were moments when his mind drifted back to his family. He carried thoughts of Sarah and his children like small lanterns inside a dark tunnel. They were reminders of the life he had left behind, life that seemed more distant with each passing day. Still, he pushed forward. He believed that winning the war meant protecting everything he loved. He believed that every battle, every gunshot, every raid brought him closer to safety for his family. But the truth was the opposite. With each violent act, Jim stepped further away from the life he once knew and deeper into a world he could never escape. Missouri continued to burn around him. Towns were torn apart. Families fled. Battles erupted without warning. And Jim Crow Chiles, once a young man with a hot temper, was now a hardened warrior shaped by blood and fire. He had entered the war as a man already carrying anger. He would leave it as something much darker. The war did not just use him, it changed him forever. And when the last battles faded and the Confederacy fell, Jim Crow Chiles stepped out of the smoke and into a world that no longer understood him, a world not ready for the man he had become, a world that would soon learn that peace was not something he could live in. When the Civil War finally ended, the country tried to breathe again. Towns wanted peace. Families wanted healing. Soldiers wanted rest. But for Jim Crow Chiles, peace did not feel like peace at all. It felt foreign, unnatural, wrong. The war had changed him in ways he did not fully understand. Before the fighting, he had been a man with a hot temper. After the fighting, he was a man whose temper had turned into something sharper, something that cut him from the inside out. The war had carved new lines into his face, deepened the shadows behind his eyes, and hardened his heart in ways no one could easily soften. For years he had ridden with guerrillas, men who trusted only their guns and their instincts. Every sunrise had been a warning. Every noise in the night could have been death. Jim had learned to survive by reacting fast, striking first, and trusting no one outside his circle. Those habits, burned into him by violence, did not disappear when the shooting stopped. Now, standing in the quiet streets of Missouri, Jim felt lost. The silence of peace was louder than the gunfire had ever been. He tried to return to ordinary life. He went back to his home, his wife Sarah, and their children. Sarah greeted him with hope, believing that the man she married was still inside him, somewhere beneath the battle scars. She spoke softly, cooked warm meals, and tried to guide him into routines that once made sense. But Jim did not feel like the same man. He would sit at the edge of the bed at night, staring into the dark, hearing echoes from battlefields where friends had died. He would walk outside during the day, scanning the horizon as if waiting for an enemy to appear. Loud noises made him jump. Sudden movements made him reach instinctively for a gun. The world around him moved slowly, gently, but Jim moved like a coiled spring. Neighbors noticed the change. Before the war, Jim had been unpredictable but understandable. After the war, he seemed carved from a harder material. He didn't smile as easily. He didn't joke as he once did on rare good days. Instead, he walked with a watchful intensity, his hand always near his hip, his eyes cold and distant. People whispered that he was still fighting a war that the rest of the country had already declared over in town. Many avoided him, some out of fear, others out of resentment. Missouri had been torn apart by divided loyalty, and now, Union supporters who once feared Jim during the war saw him returning with a reputation soaked in violence. They did not welcome him. They did not trust him, and Jim did not trust them either. He carried grudges from wartime, deep and personal. He remembered faces, names, insults. He remembered who threatened his family. He remembered who burned homes, who supported Union raids, who cheered when Confederates fell. Jim Crow Chiles had a long memory and an unforgiving nature. This made ordinary life dangerous. Small arguments became heated. Old tensions resurfaced. People tried to move on, but Jim could not. Every disagreement felt like an attack. Every raised voice felt like a challenge. And Jim, shaped by years of sudden violence, reacted as if the war still raged around him. But the most tragic part of this new life was not seen by neighbors or townsfolk. It was seen by Sarah and the children. He loved them deeply, more deeply than he ever admitted aloud. But love did not erase the violence inside him, it only strained against it. His children approached him carefully, sensing the tension in their father. Sarah tried to hold the family together, but she also knew the truth. The war had taken something from Jim that would never return. It had taken his ability to feel safe, and a man who never feels safe cannot ever truly be at peace. At times, Jim tried. He worked the land. He spent time with the children. He attempted to laugh at small things. But any hint of disrespect from outsiders, any argument in town, any sense of danger, real or imagined, brought his war-trained instincts surging back. He would step forward. He would clench his jaw. His eyes would narrow, and the man shaped by battle would return. Missouri was struggling to rebuild, but it was still a place of hard tempers, broken loyalties, and unsettled grudges. Armed men were common. Fights still erupted in saloons. Echoes of wartime violence were everywhere. And Jim, already living on the edge, found himself pushed again and again toward conflict. Some said he carried the war inside him like a ghost. Others said he was simply born wild, and the war only gave him permission to show it. But those who knew him well, especially the younger family, believed something else. They believed Jim was a victim of a world that demanded violence from him, and then refused to take responsibility for what it created. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. Peace was not Jim Crow Chiles' world, and sooner or later, violence would call his name again. Asterisk after the war, the town of Independence, Missouri, tried to rebuild itself. New shops opened. Farmers returned to their fields. Children played in dusty streets again. But even as life slowly returned to normal, one thing continued to unsettle the people who lived there at the presence of Jim Crow Chiles. Every time his boots hit the wooden sidewalks, the mood shifted. The lively chatter inside saloons dimmed. Dice games suddenly paused. Eyes turned, but quickly looked away. People felt uneasy around him, not only because of the violence he was capable of, but because no one could predict when it might appear. Jim walked with the heavy confidence of a man who had survived hell and no longer feared anything on this earth. His coat swung openly, showing the revolver on his hip, always within easy reach. His steps were steady and bold, as if each one declared, "Don't test me." And no one did. The townspeople had seen many rough men over the years. Independence was no stranger to gunfighters, drifters, or ex-soldiers trying to find their footing. But Jim was different. He didn't brag. He didn't laugh loudly. He didn't start fights just to show off. Instead, he had something far more intimidating. A quiet, simmering danger. A stillness that could change to violence in one heartbeat. Some said he carried death in his shadow. Others said he walked like a man who expected betrayal at any moment. Whatever people believed, one thing was true. Independence did not relax when Jim Chiles was in town. He often visited saloons after long days of working or after restless nights of pacing at home. Inside those dimly lit rooms, he would sit alone at a corner table, hat tilted low, eyes watching everything. He didn't drink to forget. He drank to stay sharp. Whiskey steadied his nerves, but never dulled his senses. Bartenders poured his drink quickly. No one wanted to see him angry, and everyone knew he could turn from calm to deadly in seconds. There were times when fights nearly erupted. Maybe someone said the wrong thing, or stared too long, or brought up the war. But before fists were thrown or guns were drawn, people stepped back. No one wanted to be the one who pushed Jim too far. His reputation as a fearless bushwhacker, one who had ridden with Bloody Bill Anderson, still echoed through Missouri like a dark legend. And yet, Jim didn't spend all his time seeking conflict. Much of his time in town was quiet. He bought supplies for Sarah. He visited blacksmiths to check on his horses. He walked into the post office for letters. But even in these simple moments, his presence stirred unease. Mothers pulled their children inside when they saw him coming. Merchants watched from doorways rather than greet him. Shopkeepers gave him everything he needed, but with trembling hands. The fear wasn't always because of what Jim did. Sometimes it was because of what people expected him to do. Jim noticed the fear, but he didn't change his behavior. He was used to being feared. The war had taught him that respect and fear often looked the same. And if being feared kept trouble away from his family, then so be it. Still, deep inside, a part of him felt tired of suspicion, tired of watching his back, tired of carrying the weight of his past everywhere he went. But he didn't know how to release that weight. The habits he had formed during the war, the suspicion, the readiness to react, the quickness to defend, had become part of him now, woven tightly into his identity. Sometimes he walked alone into the fields outside town, trying to find calm in the open air. But even there, he couldn't rest. Every sound made him turn. Every shadow made him tighten his grip. Peace followed him nowhere. Independence was rebuilding, but it was also a place filled with old grudges. Former Union supporters held bitterness toward Confederate men like Jim. Former Confederates still felt anger toward Union loyalists. Jim found himself caught between these worlds, unwilling to let go of the past and unable to move forward. One of the biggest problems was his short temper. When someone insulted Jim intentionally or not, Jim reacted instantly. He didn't believe in letting things go. He didn't believe in turning the other cheek. In his mind, ignoring disrespect was the same as admitting weakness. So small arguments quickly became intense. A simple comment could become a heated exchange. And heated exchanges with Jim Crow Chiles rarely ended well. The sheriff's office kept a close eye on him. Some deputies whispered that someone should have arrested Jim long ago. Others said such an attempt would only end with dead lawmen. But all of them agreed. Jim Crow Chiles was a man who could spark violence with the slightest provocation, and that spark was getting closer, because behind closed doors, Union supporters quietly discussed how dangerous he was. Town officials debated what to do, and one name kept coming up: Deputy Marshal James Peacock, a man known for stubbornness and a deep sense of law and order. The law and Jim were on a collision course. Everyone felt it, even if no one said it out loud. The town held its breath every time Jim walked by, because sooner or later, something would happen, something that would change independence forever. Jim Crow Chiles was not a peaceful man, but even he could not imagine how violently his life would collide with the land, how deadly the outcome would be. Asterisk for many people in independence. Jim Crow Chiles was nothing more than a walking thread, a man shaped by war, anger, and broken loyalties. They saw the gun on his hip, the sharpness in his eyes, the steady steps of a man who feared nothing. They saw the legend, the reputation, the danger. But behind the stories, behind the fear, behind the silence that followed him into every room, there was another version of Jim Crow Chiles, a version almost no one ever saw. This part of him lived at home, inside the four walls where Sarah and the children waited. In that quiet space, far from saloons and arguments, Jim was gentler. A different fire burned in him, there, not the fire of violence, but the fire of love, fierce and protective. At night, he sometimes sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the Missouri countryside, watching the stars as his children played at his feet. He rarely smiled in town, but at home he sometimes did. Small smiles, soft smiles Sarah held close in her memory, hoping they meant the man she married was still alive somewhere inside him. He was proud of his family, proud of Sarah's strength, proud of his children's laughter, proud even of the younger clan he had married into. Family mattered more than anything to Jim. Maybe too much, but that deep loyalty, admirable inside the home, became dangerous outside it, because when Jim felt someone had insulted his family, threatened them, or disrespected their name, something inside him snapped. He didn't see such moments as small problems. He saw them as attacks, and his answer to attacks had always been the same: fight back. Still, the softer side of Jim was real, even if buried beneath layers of anger and memory. His children often ran to him when he returned home, climbing onto his legs or pulling at his coat with excitement. And Jim, who could stare down armed men without blinking, melted at the sound of their laughter. He lifted them in his arms. He told them short stories. He brushed dust from their hair. He tried, in his own way, to give them something better than he had ever lived. But the war followed him like a shadow. Even at home, he couldn't escape it. Some nights, Sarah woke to find Jim standing by the window, staring out into the darkness with a revolver in his hand. When she asked what he heard, he always answered the same way: something moving, or just making sure we're safe. He never felt safe. Not truly. Not fully. The war had trained him to expect danger every moment. Even at the dinner table, he sat facing the door. Even in conversations, he listened to every sound around him. The habits of survival didn't leave. They only grew quieter. Waiting beneath the surface, Sarah saw all of this and worried. She loved him fiercely, but she feared for him too. She feared that one day his temper would push him too far. She feared the town's suspicion. She feared the lawmen watching him, whispering his name like a threat. She feared, most of all, that Jim was fighting battles long after the war had ended. As for Jim, he sometimes tried to explain the things he felt, the pressure in his chest, the restlessness, the anger he didn't always understand. But the words came out wrong, tangled and sharp. He had never been a man of gentle explanations. He knew how to fight, not how to describe the scars the war had carved into his mind. So he carried it in silence. He tried to work the land for a while. He tried to keep his head down. He tried to give his children a safe home. But every time he stepped into independence, the old instincts returned. His shoulders tensed. His vision sharpened. His hand drifted to his gun without thinking. He didn't want to be feared, but he didn't know how to be anything else. And everyone, from shopkeepers to deputies, sensed the tension. They saw a man who was keeping himself under control, but barely. They saw the war living inside him. They saw a man who wanted peace, but did not know how to reach it. Behind closed doors, some people said they felt sorry for him. Others said he deserved no sympathy. But none of them truly knew the truth. Jim Crow Chiles was trying to be a husband, trying to be a father, trying to be a man who could outrun the violence that had shaped him. But the world around him would not let him forget. Old enemies remembered his name. New tensions grew in the shadows, and lawmen were watching for a single mistake. This was the hidden tragedy of Jim Crow Chiles inside the home. He was a man searching for peace. Outside, he was a man others expected to explode, and the gap between those two versions of him was growing, stretching tight like a rope that could snap at any moment. Soon, that rope would break, and when it did, the life Jim tried to hold together would crash into the life he could never escape. Asterisk, as the months passed, independence continued trying to rebuild itself. But underneath the calm surface, old wounds remained open. Men who supported the Union still carried deep anger toward the former Confederates. Former Confederates still held bitterness toward the Union loyalists. The war was over. But in Missouri, peace had never fully arrived. And in the center of that fragile calm walked Jim Crow Chiles, a man who could turn suspicion into fear with a single glance. For a long time, the people of Independence kept their distance. Jim kept his head down most days. He tried not to cause trouble unless provoked. But the problem was simple. Jim didn't need much provocation, and Independence was full of men who disliked him. Everyone expected trouble, but no one knew when it would come. And like dry grass, waiting for a spark, the town braced itself for the moment when Jim's temper met the wrong man on the wrong day. That moment arrived on a hot afternoon in July of 1873. Jim rode into Independence with a simple purpose. He needed supplies, nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. He tied his horse near the town square and walked toward a nearby shop. His long coat swung behind him, the revolver at his side clearly visible. As usual, conversations quieted when he passed. For most people, Jim's silence was intimidating enough. But one man didn't lower his eyes. One man didn't step aside. That man was Deputy Marshal James Peacock. Peacock was not known for keeping the peace gently. He was a strict, stubborn lawman who believed the war was over and the law was the law, no exceptions. Not even for feared men like Jim Chiles. Some said Peacock resented men like Jim. Others said he simply enjoyed confrontation. Whatever the reason, the two men were destined to collide. Peacock was standing near the street, talking to a group of locals. When he saw Jim walking toward him, something in Peacock's expression hardened. He stepped away from the group and positioned himself directly in Jim's pathos. If daring him to pass, Jim stopped, watching him with cold, tired eyes. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't speak. He only stared. Peacock broke the silence. "What are you doing in town, Chiles?" he asked, loud enough for bystanders to hear. Jim didn't answer immediately. He didn't like being challenged. He didn't like being questioned, and he certainly didn't like being spoken to as if he were a criminal. Finally, he said in a flat voice, "Getting supplies. Same as any man." Peacock narrowed his eyes. "You've caused enough trouble in this town. Maybe it's time you learned to show respect." The words were sharp, too sharp. A small crowd began forming inside doorways, watching carefully but quietly. Everyone knew the danger of pushing Jim too far, but everyone also knew Peacock wasn't the type of man to back down. Jim lifted his chin slightly, his expression tightening. "I don't need lessons on respect," he said, "least of all from you." Peacock stepped closer. "You watch your mouth." And then something happened that no one fully agreed on later. Some said Jim laughed under his breath. Others said he muttered something about Peacock's authority. Others claimed Jim called him a coward to his face. But every version agreed on one point. Jim Crow Chiles spoke words that deeply insulted Deputy Peacock, words that struck like a spark on gasoline. Peacock's temper flared instantly. "You're under arrest," he snapped. Jim's face went still, deadly still. Arrest. For what? Insulting a lawman, speaking his mind, or simply existing? Whatever the reason, Jim's instincts, sharpened by years of sudden violence, roared to life. His hand twitched near his revolver. He didn't plan to shoot. Not yet. But he wasn't going to let Peacock place a hand on him either. Peacock stepped forward. Jim shifted his stance. A nearby woman gasped. Everyone knew what was about to happen. Everyone wanted to look away, but COULDN, single quotes T. Jim spoke one final sentence. Quiet, controlled, deadly. "Touch me, and you'll regret it." That was all it took. Peacock reached for his weapon. Jim reached for his to men, both with pride, both with tempers, both believing they were in the right head, crossed a line they could not return from. The moment stretched thin, like a thread pulled tight. Every heartbeat felt like an explosion waiting to happen. The spark had finally arrived, and in just a few seconds, independence would explode into violence that no one could stop. The words had been spoken, the challenge had been made, and the deadly end of Jim Crow Chiles' story was about to begin. Asterisk, the tension between Jim Crow Chiles and Deputy Marshal James Peacock sat in the air like lightning waiting to strike. People around them felt it instantly, the shift. The sharp breath of danger, the sense that they were standing in the middle of something they had no power to stop. For a moment, independence fell silent. Even the horses tied along the street seemed frozen. Jim's hand hovered near his hip. Peacock's fingers twitched close to his belt. Two men, both fueled by pride, both hardened by their own battles, now stared at each other with the full weight of their pasts behind them. No one later agreed on who moved first. But everyone agreed the whole thing happened in less than a heartbeat. Peacock's hand snapped downward. Jim's arm moved at the same time, and then bang. A single gunshot cracked through the dusty street, echoing off wooden buildings and shattering the fragile illusion of peace the town had tried so hard to rebuild. People ducked. A few screamed. Others pressed themselves against nearby walls. The air filled with smoke, hot and thick. Jim stumbled back a step. Peacock fired again. Bang. Jim staggered but didn't fall. He drew his own revolver and fired a desperate shot. Bang. The bullet missed Peacock, but shattered a window behind him, sending sharp pieces of glass spraying across the ground. The street erupted. Horses reared. Men yelled for cover. A woman grabbed her child and ducked behind a wagon. Peacock fired again. Jim hit the ground. His back slammed onto the dirt, his hat rolling away, his gun slipping from his hand. The sun beat down on him, warm and blinding. For a moment, he tried to rise, pushing himself up with shaking arms, but his strength was fading fast. Peacock stepped forward, breathing hard, gun still aimed, eyes locked on the man who had challenged him. The crowd watched in stunned silence. They had always expected Jim's temper to bring trouble, but no one had imagined an ending like this. Jim tried to speak, but only blood filled his mouth. His fingers curled weakly toward the revolver lying inches from his hand, but his body no longer obeyed him. He collapsed again. This time he didn't rise. Deputy Marshal Peacock stopped just a few feet from Jim's body. His chest rose and fell in quick, sharp breaths. Sweat ran down his temple. His hand trembled, slightly not from fear, but from the force of adrenaline. He looked down at Jim Crow Chiles, the man whose name had carried fear for years. Jim was still breathing, but barely. His eyes stared upward, unfocused, fading. The once fierce, unbreakable fire inside him flickered like a dying flame. Some of the townspeople slowly approached. Others stayed back, afraid that one wrong move might start another round of shooting. Independence had seen its share of gunfights, but this one felt different. This was not two drunks in a bar, not a simple argument over cards. This was the fall of a man who had once been larger than life. Peacock finally turned to the crowd, his voice tight. "It's done," he said. "It had to be done." He spoke the words like a justification, maybe for them, maybe for himself. Jim Crow Chiles lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath him, his chest rising slower and slower. The dust settled around him, the echoes of gunfire fading into the summer heat. The same town that had once feared him now watched him with a strange mixture of shock and curiosity. A few men knelt beside him, unsure whether to help or simply witness the end. One man whispered, almost to himself, "That's Jim Crow Chiles. God help us." Another shook his head. He finally pushed too far. But Jim wasn't thinking about the town. He wasn't thinking about Peacock. His last thoughts drifted toward home, toward Sarah, toward his children, toward the life he had tried and failed to rebuild. His breaths grew shallower. His fingers twitched one final time. And then he went still. The legend of Jim Crow Chiles, bushwhacker, fighter, feared man of Missouri, ended there in the dirt of Independence, shot down in the center of town, the same way he had lived, in conflict. Peacock holstered his weapon slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't look proud. He simply nodded once, as if accepting the weight of what had happened, and walked away through the stunned crowd. No one cheered. No one clapped him on the back. Even those who had despised Jim felt the heaviness of the moment, because something had changed in Independence that day. Something had ended. The shadow of Jim Crow Chiles, which had hung over the town for years, was gone. But the echo of his life, the violence, the loyalty, the fear would remain long after the dust settled. What no one knew then was this: the story wasn't over. Not yet. Not for the Chiles family. Not for the young son who watched his father's death from miles away and felt fury ignite inside him, fury that would soon lead to tragedy of its own. Asterisk news traveled fast in Independence, Missouri, before the sun had even finished setting on the day Jim Crow Chiles fell. Whispers rushed through streets and homes like a cold wind. People spoke about the gunfight. They repeated details, some true, some exaggerated. They argued about who shot first, who started the trouble, who was right, who was wrong. But while the town argued, one person wasn't listening. One person wasn't debating. One person felt only one thing rage. That person was Jim's teenage son, a boy who had grown up watching his father walk through the world like an unbreakable force. To him, Jim Crow Chiles wasn't a threat, or a rumor, or a warning. He was simply father strong, fearless, and larger than life. And now he was gone, shot down in the middle of town, killed in front of people who had feared him for years. The boy could hardly breathe when he heard the news. He felt something inside him snap, something sharp and deep. He didn't cry, not at first. Instead, he sat still, staring forward. His fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mother, Sarah, tried to comfort him. She tried to explain, to soften the blow, to tell him that nothing good would come from anger. But the boy didn't hear her. His thoughts were louder than her voice. Thoughts of revenge, thoughts of justice, thoughts of a world where his father did not deserve to die the way he had. He remembered the nights when Jim sat on the porch, holding him close while the stars glimmered above. He remembered the way Jim taught him how to ride, how to aim, how to stand tall, how to defend the people he loved. He remembered Jim's rough hands, lifting him up, placing him on a horse, telling him, "You protect family, always." Those words became a fire inside him, a fire he could not put out. He didn't see the complicated man the town saw. He didn't see the temper, the trouble, the danger. He saw only the father who carried his scars with pride and loved his children fiercely. And so, the boy made up his mind. Deputy Marshal James Peacock had killed his father, and that meant Peacock had to die. The days after Jim's death were tense. People watched the Chiles home with worry. Some wondered if the Youngers would get involved. Others wondered if the family would flee, but no one expected what truly happened next. One morning, the boy slipped out before dawn. No one saw him leave. No one knew where he went. He took his father's revolver, with him the same gun Jim had reached for. In his final moments, he rode toward independence, with fire in his eyes and grief gripping his heart. He wasn't thinking about consequences. He wasn't thinking about the future. He was thinking only of his father lying in a dusty street, bleeding to death under the hot sun. For him, this wasn't violence. This was justice. A son defending his father's honor. When he arrived in town, he didn't hide. He didn't sneak around. He rode straight toward the place where his father had died right, toward the office where Deputy Peacock worked. People stared at him in shock. Some recognized him instantly. Others couldn't believe a boy would storm into town with such fury. But his face tight, pale, determined left no doubt. He was Jim Crow Chiles' son. Peacock wasn't hard to find. He was near the jailhouse, speaking with another deputy. He turned at the sound of fast hoofbeats. When he saw the boy, he froze. The boy didn't hesitate. He raised the revolver. His voice shook, but his aim did not. "You killed my father," he said. "Now I'm here for you." Peacock stepped back, stunned. He didn't reach for his gun immediately, maybe out of surprise, maybe out of guilt, maybe because he didn't want to shoot a child. The hesitation was dangerous when dealing with grief and rage. The boy fired. Bang. The bullet missed, striking wood behind Peacock. People screamed. Men scattered. Doors slammed shut. For a moment, it seemed like the chaos of Jim's final moments had returned. Peacock moved now instinctively, decisively. His hand dropped to his gun. He shouted for the boy to stop, to lower the weapon, to think. But the boy didn't stop. Couldn't stop. His world had already ended. He was simply following its last command. He aimed again. Peacock fired first. Bang. The sound echoed down the street, the same echo that had taken Jim's life days earlier. The boy dropped his father's revolver. He swayed, and then he collapsed onto the dirt. People rushed forward, but it was too late. The young life, burning with hurt and revenge, faded fast. His final breath left him as quietly as a whisper. There were no cheers, no relief, only a heavy silence that pressed down on the entire town. 2 Chiles men dead within days. A father and son, swallowed by the same cycle of violence. Sarah Chiles, when she learned the news, didn't scream. She didn't even speak. She simply sank to the floor, holding her hands to her face, letting grief swallow her whole. The tragedy was complete. The Chiles family was broken, and Independence, Missouri, carried a new scar. But history is strange. Even when a man dies, his legend does not always die with him, and the story of Jim Crow Chiles would linger long after the dust covered his grave. Asterisk. After the deaths of Jim Crow Chiles and his young son, a deep quiet settled over Independence, Missouri. It wasn't the peaceful quiet people had hoped for after the war. It was a heavy quiet, filled with sadness, confusion, and questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Some townspeople believed that justice had been served. Others whispered that things had gone too far. But no matter what people thought, the truth hung above Independence like a dark cloud. A feared man had fallen. And then, heartbreakingly, his son had followed. The Chiles' home was filled with grief. Sarah, who had tried for years to keep her family safe from Jim's temper and the world's violence, was now left with memories instead of children's laughter. She moved through the house like a shadow, touching her husband's coat, her son's empty chair, the quiet porch where Jim had once sat with pride in his eyes. Life had taken more from her than she ever thought possible. The younger family, already burdened by their own troubles, gathered around her. Cole Younger, Jim's nephew by marriage, rode to the home as soon as he heard the news. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but he sat with Sarah, offering silent support. He understood loss. He understood how violence could rip through a family and leave nothing but pieces behind. The Youngers buried Jim and his son side by side on a small hill, under a patch of Missouri sky that felt far too peaceful for men who had died with guns drawn. The wind was gentle that day, brushing through the grass as if whispering a final goodbye. People attended the funeral quietly, some out of respect, some out of curiosity, some simply because Jim Crow Chiles had been such a powerful presence in their lives, fearful or not that his end felt like the end of an era. As the coffins were lowered into the ground, one old man muttered, "He lived hard, and he died the only way he knew how." Another answered softly, "It didn't have to end like this." Perhaps it didn't, but the world Jim lived in was never gentle, and men shaped by violence rarely found soft endings. After the burial, life resumed in independence, but something felt changed. The tension that had followed Jim everywhere seemed to loosen. The fear that once clung to the saloons and streets faded, but in its place, a strange emptiness lingered, a reminder of how complicated the man had been. Jim Crow Chiles was not just an outlaw, not just a fighter, not just a man with a temper. He had been a father, a husband, a man shaped by a cruel war and a harsher peace. A man who tried to rebuild his life, but couldn't escape the storms inside him. Years passed, and stories about Jim began to shift. Some people softened their memories of him, talking about his loyalty to his family, his bravery during war, his rare moments of calm. Others hardened their stories, focusing on the violence he caused and the fear he spread. History often chooses its own version of a man. And for Jim, both sides stayed alive. His name continued to echo in Missouri folklore, ever as famous as Jesse James or the Younger Brothers, but always present in the shadowy corners of their stories. When people spoke of the wild men who shaped the frontier, Jim's name sometimes slipped through the conversation like a ghost. Not always the villain, not always the hero, just a man caught between worlds. Some historians said he represented the tragedy of guerrilla fighters who couldn't adjust to peace. Others called him the embodiment of the Missouri-Kansas border war, symbol of how deep wounds can run, long after the fighting stops. But those who knew him personally, the Youngers, Sarah, the handful of friends who dared stay close, remembered him differently. They remembered the man who fought fiercely for his family, the man who loved his children with a tenderness he rarely showed in public, the man who carried pain like a second skin. They remembered his flaws, yes, but they also remembered his strength, his determination, his fire. And in those memories, Jim Crow Chiles became more than a cautionary tale. He became a reminder of how war can twist a life, how violence can seep into a man's bones until he can no longer separate who he is from what he has done. He became a reminder that some men are born into storms and some never find their way out. As for independence, the town carried on. New faces came, old grudges faded, buildings rose where old ones had burned. But the story of Jim Crow Chiles lingered quietly in the background, as ghost stories often do. Sometimes, late at night, old men sitting outside the saloons would point to the dusty street and say, "That's where Chiles fell." And younger listeners leaned in, eager to hear the tale of a man who lived fast, fought hard, and died as fiercely as he lived. In the end, Jim Crow Chiles became part of the tapestry of the American Wild West, a complex, flawed, fiery man, whose life reflected the violent, uncertain times he lived in. Not a hero, not a villain. Something in between, something human. And though his story ended in blood and tragedy, it remains a powerful chapter in the forgotten history of Missouri's wild frontier, story of loyalty, anger, love, and the unbreakable bond between a father and son who both paid the highest price.